My name is Rabbi Chaim Dov Belyak. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, California. I'm the volunteer executive director of Friends of Jewish Renewal in Poland. And I'm happy to be one of the co-hosts for a series of programs that we have entitled Freighted Legacies, the Culture and History of Jewish Interactions in Poland. This is now a series of some 8 or 9 conversations and presentations that we've had on the cultural and historical bridge that exists between Jews that live in various lands, but have their origins in Poland and have often not had the opportunity to learn about the past that is so rich from the cultural heritage that originated in what we call the Polish lands. This morning, we have a very interesting program which we'll introduce in a moment, but I'm pleased to welcome you, and we are indeed a dual language program. So I want to call your attention to something at the bottom of your screen. You'll notice at the bottom, there is an opportunity for you to choose either the English or the Polish track. And I hope that you figured that out by now and are listening in the most comfortable track for you. Let us get right to our activities by first introducing other members of the panel and our main presenter. I'm very proud to introduce my teacher who brought me through the first steps of learning what we call midrash, and then what went on in his life after many years of teaching midrash to generations of rabbis to become an analyst. And it was in thinking about who it was that would be most appropriate from the American side to receive the thought of Lena's work that I thought of my teacher and friend, Rabbi Louis Barth, and we are appreciative to have him on the panel. As you've already heard, we have on the panel as well Tul'si Bhambry, who is a translator of this work into English. And I encourage all of you to go to her website. I was intrigued by all of her work in not only translation, but in the study of various aspects of Polish literature and other forms of literature. They will be asking some questions, and we invite eventually the members of our community to join in asking questions. But now it's our opportunity to introduce Lena, who we had the privilege of hearing from several weeks ago when she participated in the program The Honey and the Sting, a book written by Rabbi Walter Rothschild, and then translated into Polish by Marzena Szymanska, who's doing the translating here, and edited by Lena Magnone. It was an opportunity for us to learn about the experience of people who have chosen to participate in the process of being involved in Jewish life. And today we're going to hear about Lena's work, which is a result of her habilitation. For those of you who do not know the European system, when a person has generally reached a much older age than Lena is now, usually 55, 60, they produce their magnum opus, the culmination of all their work. I will not give you away Lena's age, but in 2016, she was in her 30s when she completed her habilitation. And it is a privilege to be introducing her to the American-speaking audience and to introduce her important work, which is entitled Freud's Emissaries, the Cultural Transfer of Psychoanalysis to the Polish Intelligentsia before World War II. This is a broad study of 1,100 pages. And I had the privilege of reading the introduction in English to get a sneak preview. And the Polish introduction will be available on our website in a few days. Let me say that the process by which this wonderful person has become not only a member of the Jewish faith, but one of the people in the forefront of the intellectual community that is a part of Poland and the international community of scholars is wonderful to behold. Lena is an assistant professor at the University of Warsaw. She is currently doing research in Germany for further studies. Her work has included a great deal of what we call cultural historical studies that attempt to bring to the fore the rich cultural heritage that was part of Poland and Central Europe. And without taking any more time away from her, we'd like to welcome her and invite her to participate with us in this participation. She's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, then there'll be an opportunity for the panelists to respond. And welcome, Lena. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you and to present my research. Let me share my screen so I can show you my presentation. I will use a lot of names and other data, so it will be easier for you to follow. My book is indeed called Freud's Emissaries, the cultural transfer of psychoanalysis to the Polish intelligentsia before World War II. And before I go any further, I think I need to start by giving some background information about the history of psychoanalysis and its cultural context. So this is the first part of my today's talk. Main argument of my book is that the apparition of psychoanalysis at the end of the 19th century can be seen as one of the pariah strategies. I use this notion after Hannah Arendt, for whom the Jews' status as scorned outsiders in European societies explains their propensity for revolt and utopia, which is most clear in evidence in the very countries of emancipation. Indeed, in the late 19th century Vienna, Jews were often revolutionaries, supporters of cultural rebellion, who worked on projects for a new and better world. Their frequent alliance with other outsiders and rebels, for instance, with movements such as psychoanalysis, but also revolutionary socialism or the Vienna secession, went hand in hand with the hope of creating a new society, a society of the future in which they would finally be at home, where they would no more be treated as others. A pariah strategy, in my understanding, is also a mechanism of social advancement accessible to the empire's pariahs. Not only Freud's, but also, as I will try to demonstrate, the biographies of other members of the psychoanalytic movement are a perfect illustration of the tension typically experienced by Jews who came of age in the Austria-Hungary towards the end of the 19th century. A tension between the aspirations of their parents, who had provided the economic and educational conditions for their full emancipation, and the antagonism of an increasingly anti-Semitic society, which placed hurdles in their way to full participation, thereby forcing them to make compromises in their career choices. Let's see how it influenced Freud's life trajectory. He was born in 1856 as the son of a trader in the Moravian town of Freiberg, which is today Przybor in the Czech Republic. After his family moved to Vienna, he was sent first to a gymnasium This was the only secondary school that offered a classical education and ended with the Matura examination, which must be passed in order to apply to a university. Then Freud went to study medicine. This was a typical trajectory for an Austrian Jew. The December Constitution of 1867 guaranteed full civil rights for Jews, among others, lifting the restrictions to their migrations within the empire. At the turn of the century, Vienna's Jewish population oscillated around the 10% mark, but over 30% of pupils at the city's gymnasium secondary schools. For a Jewish family, to send at least one of their sons to a gymnasium was an important step towards assimilation and upward social mobility. This is evident from the data on the professions of the gymnasium pupils' fathers and the boys' future educational development. Among the pupils whose fathers were traders, no less than 80% were Jewish. Moreover, while sons of non-Jewish families tended to work in the same profession as their fathers, 93% of Jewish boys whose fathers were traders became doctors. In the 1880s, 1/3 of all students at the University of Vienna was Jewish. Most of them studied at the Faculty of Medicine. In the 1920s, about half of all doctors in Vienna were Jewish. Those hopes, the hopes of the second generation of assimilated Jews, were thwarted by the municipal elections of 1895, which led to the victory of a right-wing coalition headed by Mayor Karl Lueger. Before World War I, Vienna was the only European capital that had elected an openly anti-Semitic city council, and it soon became the center of anti-Semitism in Europe. Now, 1895 is the year when Freud's studies on hysteria were published, and Freud's first use of the term psychoanalysis can be dated to 1896. Indeed, at the beginning of his career, Freud was a neurologist with a focus on the anatomy of the nervous system. He hoped to move up the academic ladder in the established field of medicine. He turned to psychoanalysis when anti-Semitism was on the increase in Vienna. It was beginning to play a role among university authorities, crushing Freud's hopes for a career in academia. With the victory of Karl Lueger and the Christian Social Party, moreover, the liberals were out of the game, which is why Freud also had to give up his ambitions to become a career politician. Incidentally, this is the exact moment when Theodor Herzl came up with the idea of Zionism. Note that his early life has many similarities with that of Freud, who was only 4 years older than Herzl. Born in Budapest, Theodor Herzl graduated with a law degree from the University of Vienna, then became a respected contributor to Neue Freie Presse. The Jewish State was published in early 1896, right after this election. I must stress that Jewish doctors in late 19th century Vienna were working within an openly racist medical discourse that portrayed Jews as particularly prone to mental illnesses, as well as sexuality transmitted diseases. By participating in this discourse, they had to distance themselves from their own Jewishness, splitting up into the subject and the object of study. Psychoanalysis, by rejecting the hereditary character of neurosis and stressing the universality of mental complexes, offered a brilliant resolution to this problem. Now, Freud had worked on his own until about 1902. At this moment, the earliest supporters of psychoanalysis, there were only 4 Jewish doctors about a decade younger than Freud, started to meet in Freud's apartment every Wednesday evening. Over the next few years, the group grew, and in 1908, it was renamed Vienna Psychoanalytical Society. It had about 20 members at the time and resembled the philosophical and artistic circles popular in Vienna's coffee houses more than a traditional scientific institution. By 1930, this little group of Freud's students had institutionalized itself as an international movement with a dozen local groups, an umbrella organization, international congresses, its own publishing house, and a few periodicals. The international spread of psychoanalysis was eventually what saved Freud and his followers, allowing them not only to leave Europe and emigrate, mostly to Great Britain, Palestine, and above all, the United States, but also guaranteed its survival as a discipline. Of the 150 individuals, 107 men and 33 women who joined the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society at some point before its official dissolution in 1938, 3/4 were Jewish. And here you can see how it evaluated with time. As for their place of birth, 1/3 had migrated from the eastern territories of the Habsburg monarchy, but as you can see, especially from Galicia. It was the empire's poorest and less developed part, covering the land of today's South Poland and West Ukraine. And it is estimated that as a result of Jewish migration in 1910, about 1 in 4 of Vienna's Jews was born in Galicia. So the members of Vienna Psychoanalytic Society usually came from secularized and assimilated middle-class families. Here, nearly all men had attended the classical gymnasium in their hometown and then moved to Vienna to attend university. Most had studied medicine, law, and philosophy came second. Half of the male VPS members were sons of merchants, and only 11 had not managed to obtain a higher education. The majority of Freud's followers joined the movement only when they were denied other educational or career options. If Jewish medical students were directed towards psychiatry, it was not so much on account of their personal interests. Non-Jewish students who had access to a variety of specializations tended to shun psychiatry, which could only be practiced in hospitals and was therefore less profitable. The field was left to Jewish students until the rise of anti-Semitism eliminated this option and pushed Jewish psychiatrists towards psychoanalysis. This young discipline was considered unscientific and functioned on the margins of the medical establishment. It was strongly associated with Jewishness. It was barely taken seriously and sometimes openly mocked. It was open to any new sympathizer and had few entry conditions. In other words, it seemed like the only realistic career option. And the case was not much different for women. Although in the Habsburg monarchy, women's emancipation lagged significantly behind Jewish emancipation, with the significant decline of birth rates in Jewish families, investments were made also into girls' education. As of 1896, girls were able to take the Matura examination as external candidates in secondary schools for boys, which opened the way for women to obtain a higher education. Austrian universities began to admit women in 1897, first at philosophy, and then starting in 1900 at faculties of medicine. Classical gymnasium secondary schools for girls appeared soon after. Besides pediatrics and gynecology, the most popular choice among women medical students was psychiatry. It was a relatively new field, less popular and less prestigious than the traditional specializations, and therefore more accessible to women, facing double exclusion from career opportunities on account of their Jewishness, as well as their gender. About 1 in 4 female Jewish medical students opted to train in mental health. Almost all of Freud's early women followers were recruited from this group. So after this introduction, I would like to present the biographies of the first few psychoanalysts of Polish Jewish origin. But before I start, let me remind you first that for all the 19th century and until the Second Polish Republic was established in 1918, Poland did not exist as a state. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been divided at the end of the 18th century between the three partitioning powers, namely Russian, German, and Austrian Empire. The key figures of my book were all of Jewish origin and born in partitioned Poland. That is to say, they were mostly Austrian or, for some of them, Russian citizens. While citizens of Austria followed the above described pariah strategy, choosing to attend university in capital of the Habsburg Empire, inhabitants of the Russian part avoided the center of the occupying force. They tended to go to university in Western Europe. Those who obtained their education in Switzerland would first learn about Jungian psychoanalysis in Zurich. They might later decide to visit Vienna in search of the movement sources. Within the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, they never played particularly important roles, nor did they get as close to Freud as his devout followers from Galicia. On the other hand, they were the only one who tried to establish a connection with Poland once its independence regained in 1918. The only Freudians who worked in Warsaw in the interwar period were Eugenia Sokolnicka and Gustaw Bychowski, both of whom were born here in Warsaw. But first, let me tell a few words about Galicians. I have chosen to focus on three of them: Ludwig Jekels, Helena Deutsch, née Rosenbach, and Beata Rank, née Münzer. The choice of Ludwig Jekels seemed obvious, as he was the most important actor of cultural transfer of psychoanalysis to Polish intellectual circles prior to World War I. Born in 1867 in Lviv, Jekels began to attend Freud's lectures at the University of Vienna when they attracted but a handful of listeners. He was then looking for the clues to some nervous diseases which he encountered while running a hydrotherapy facility in Bystra. He was admitted to the VPS in 1910 when the group consisted of only 22 members, and remained in the VPS as long as it existed. Having participated in the first International Psychoanalytical Congress in Salzburg in 1908, he then attended all following congresses. In 1912, having sold the sanatorium he had run in Bystra, Jekels moved to Vienna permanently, but he never slowed his efforts to introduce Freud's theories to medical circles. Most importantly, Jekels was Freud's first Polish translator. Before 1914, his translations of Freud's 5 lectures on psychoanalysis and psychopathology of everyday life appeared with the publisher Altenberg in Lviv. After the war, a second edition of Psychopathology and the translation of Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality were published by the Internationaler Psychoanalytischer Verlag in Vienna. Jekels also wrote a concise introduction, Szkic Psychoanalyzy Freuda, which can be translated as an outline of Freud's psychoanalysis. To steer an interest in psychoanalysis among Polish doctors, Jekels participated in the 2 pre-war cross-partition congresses of Polish neurologists, psychiatrists, and psychologists. The first congress took place in Warsaw in 1909. Jekels' presentation was the only one covering Freud's theory then. The second congress took place in Krakow in 1912, and thanks to Jekels' efforts, it was largely dedicated to psychoanalysis. It also succeeded to attract the attention of philosophers from the so-called Lviv school and writers such as Karol Iżykowski and Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, better known as Witkacy. In 1914, Freud wrote in the History of the Psychoanalytic Movement that Jekels alone had introduced psychoanalysis to the scientific and literary world in Poland. However, after the war, Jekels did not return to Poland. Instead, he played the role of Freud's envoy to Scandinavia in the second half of the 1930s. All members of the Finnish Psychoanalytical Society, which Jekels co-founded, were analyzed and trained by him. Following Austria's annexation by Germany in 1938, he left for the United States. In 1940, he became an honorary member of the New York Psychoanalytical Society and Institute. To become a full member, he had to obtain a license to practice medicine in New York State. This process took him 7 years. When he finally obtained his license and with it the right to practice psychoanalysis in the United States, he was already 80 years old. Jekels' selected papers, English translation of his pre-war German articles, appeared in 1952, 2 years before his death. Then Helena Deutsch's life story reflects emancipatory trends in Galicia. Born in Przemyśl as Helena Rosenbach in 1884, she was one of the first female medical students at the University of Vienna. To achieve this, she first had to pass the Matura examination as an external candidate at the St. Anne Gymnasium for Boys in Krakow. Her dream was to become a lawyer like her father, but the law departments did not admit women at the time, so she chose medicine instead. She had initially intended to specialize in pediatrics, but she eventually chose psychiatry. In her final year at the university, she worked as an intern in Emil Kreplin's clinic in Munich, where she met her future husband, Felix Deutsch. The graduation ceremony took place soon after the wedding, and her diploma bears her new married name. She was soon offered the position of full-time assistant at the University Psychiatric Clinic, headed by Julius Wagner von Jaurek, future Nobel Prize winner, where she had already worked in the past, and she soon became solely responsible for the entire women's ward. This quick rise through the ranks was related to the fact that most medical doctors had been drafted into the army. As soon as her male colleagues returned from the front, she lost her position. It is only then that she started to engage in the psychoanalytic movement. Beginning in the autumn 1918, Helen regularly participated in the meetings of DVPS, and she soon became a member, while Felix joined 4 years later. Soon thereafter, she began her analysis with Freud, and in 1925, her first book, Zur Psychologie der weiblichen Sexualfunktionen, it would later serve as a basis of her American bestseller, the 2-volume Psychology of Women, was published. The same year, she set up in Vienna a training institute and a free psychoanalytical outpatient clinic modeled on the Polyclinic in Berlin. She directed both institutions until her departure for the United States in 1935. She continued her brilliant career in Boston for several decades, working as a psychiatrist at the Massachusetts General Hospital, directing the Psychoanalytic Training Institute, and carrying out intensive research. She never visited Poland, although in her 1973 autobiography, Confrontations with Myself, she admits having always thought about herself as Polish. Deutsch's development as a psychoanalyst was in many ways typical for the first women who became Freud's disciples. The case was quite different with Beata Rank, who was 10 years younger than Deutsch and whose involvement with the Freudian movement can be said to be coincidental in many ways. Born in Nowy Sącz as Beata Münzer, she met Otto Rank when he was stationed in Krakow during World War I. They married in 1918. As the wife of Freud's favorite student, Beata, who joined the VPS in 1923, made a steep career within the organization. Otto Rank, the first psychoanalyst without a medical background, was a philosopher by training and head of the Internationales Psychoanalytischer Verlag, the publishing house. It is thanks to his wife's initiative that the series Polish Psychoanalytical Library came into being. She translated Freud's own dreams and edited the Polish section in the Internationale Zeitschrift für Psychoanalyse. Influenced by her husband, she developed an interest in the intersection of psychoanalysis and anthropology. Unfortunately, Otto Rank's break with Freud created a rift between Rank's wife and the VPS and put an end to her editorial work. Soon, the dissolution of the marriage followed, as in Paris, Otto got into an affair with an American writer, Anaïs Nin. Incidentally, the Journal of Anais Nin was for me an unexpected source in reconstructing Beata Rank's biography. In 1936, with help from Helena Deutsch, who was her friend, she settled in the Boston area. And although she had no medical background, she became a respected training analyst for childhood psychoanalysts. She was chair of the educational committee at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute and received an honorary professorship at the Boston University School of Psychiatry. Moving on to the Polish psychoanalysts who were born in the Russian partition, I will start with some extraordinary woman, Eugenia Sokolnitzka. She is known mostly as a pioneer of psychoanalysis in France. In my book, I try to give an exhaustive account of her life before she left for Paris in 1921, including not only her studies at the Sorbonne, her involvement in the Polish socialist movement, but also her efforts to establish a local psychoanalytic society in Warsaw on the eve of Poland's independence in 1918. Her plan did not come to fruition, despite a promising start with the support she got from the influential philosopher and psychologist Edward Abramowski, who unfortunately died the same year. In France, however, she not only managed to set up the Paris Psychoanalytical Society and to train the first generation of French analytics, but above all, she aroused interest in psychoanalysis among the writers associated with La Nouvelle Revue Française. The person she influenced most was André Gide, who not only portrayed the Polish analyst in his novel, The Counterfeiters, but also made use of her case study from her short Warsaw analytical practice during the First World War, analysis of an obsessional neurosis in a child. It's the basis for a chapter in this novel. And Eugenia Sokolnicka is represented by Dr. Sofroniska in this novel by Gide. And at last, Gustaw Bychowski, who can be presented as an interwar counterpart to the role that Ludwig Jekels had played before the war. Joining the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1931, when he had already returned to Warsaw after his studies in Zurich and analysis in Vienna, he became the only Freudian with a Polish passport. If Jekels was Freud's emissary to Poland, Bychowski, who was more than 30 years his junior, can be seen as the first and only ambassador of psychoanalysis to Poland. While Jekels managed to have two translations of Freud's work published by Altenberg in Lviv, Bychowski arranged for a Polish edition of Freud's Introduction to Psychoanalysis, Wstęp do Psychoanalizy, to be published by Przeworski. The translator was Salomea Kempner, also a Polish Freudian born in Płock, a town near Warsaw, and after the studies in Switzerland associated with Berlin psychoanalytic community. Like Jekels, Bychowski also wrote a book of his own, Psychoanalysis, in 1928, which was intended to serve as a medical handbook. But Bychowski also worked to introduce psychoanalysis to a broader audience in Poland. He was a regular columnist for the most important cultural weekly, Wiadomości Literackie. It was an equivalent of, Warsaw equivalent of Neue Freie Presse. He was also the author of several works on literature, including the book about a Polish author from the Romantic period, Juliusz Słowacki, called Słowacki and His Soul, 1930, and the article Marcel Proust as Poet of Psychoanalysis. He stayed in Poland until the outbreak of the war. After the nostrification of his medical diploma, he worked in New York and ran a private analytical practice and training analysis. He lectured initially at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, then until 1956 in Bellevue Medical Center and Downstate Medical School. At the end of his life, he was associated with Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Apart from Eugenia Sokolnicka, who died before war, and Stefania Borstein, likewise, who died in 1939 in Prague, as well as Salome Kempner, who perished in the Warsaw Ghetto, the translator of the introductory lectures of psychoanalysis to Polish. All other protagonists of my book, like the majority of European psychoanalysts, found themselves in the United States. In my book, I gave only a glimpse of their American careers, as I had chosen 1939 as my end date. However, I continued my research as a Fulbright Fellow in New York in 2019-2020, and soon I will start publishing its results, and I will also be very happy to present them to you on another occasion. But for today, this is what I prepared. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lena, for that presentation. It is, I dare say, I'm going to take a guess, maybe 10% of the people that you cover, a much larger number of people. And I'm going to turn first to Tul'si Bhambry to respond to your work, since she knows it most intimately as the translator into English. And maybe she can highlight some of the things for her to through her response, and then to Louis Barth.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I really enjoyed listening to this presentation, even though I know the material so well by now. But what was new to me was the graphic representation of the statistics, the photos, and the timelines, which are so helpful. I loved your map of the birthplaces of the different people. I mean, geography plays such an important role in your book. It is almost like a character in itself, because what you do is not study the influence of one culture upon another culture, but study the conditions that enable a transfer of ideas from one constellation of people, institutions, cultural and political contexts into another. And the visual material is just so very helpful. And I'm really, really grateful and very excited that the English language edition, which is forthcoming, I think in October, fingers crossed, will be a digital publication, which means that we will have the opportunity to present photos, maps, graphs, all these things, cross-references between different parts of the text, because this text is so complex. I mean, the sheer length and breadth of this material is just overwhelming. I say that as a translator who kind of burrows deep into the text and sometimes forgets the big picture, right? Because as a reader, you basically read through a text and it's all present in your mind. As a translator, you're so deep in one part of the text that you forget what came in the chapter before. So this was really, really elucidating. So just to say perhaps a few words about the challenges I faced as a translator. I'll keep my presentation very, very short, but I think it will be interesting to the audience. That we decided to write a foreword to the English edition to make the material even more accessible to international readers who may not be that familiar with Polish history, the history of Poland's partitions, for instance, but also traditions such as the Romantic or Messianic tradition, which is uniquely Polish. So we're going to write a little text, and I'm sure it will be helpful to everyone. What I most enjoyed about translating Lena's work was, I call it the impressionistic element, which means that when you're close into a passage, you might not see the big picture, but as you zoom out, it kind of makes sense as a whole, as a sort of, you feel the atmosphere. You can't really say why you feel it, but there is something uniquely alive, which I think is also due to the wealth of sources that you cite, Lena. There are letters, for instance, a Polish actress, Gabriela Zapolska, happened to spend time in Jekels's clinic, and she wrote dramatic letters to her husband. Translating those was really fun. It kind of gave me an opportunity to play with style. Letters by Helena Deutsch to her lover, if I may say so, Herman Lieberman, who then became a prominent politician in Poland. Okay, I'll just say this was, for me so far, the most extensive translation I've ever done. But it was, thanks to Lena's support, such a solid process. Lena actually provided all the quotations of books published in English, so that readers get officially translated work. For instance, quotations from Freud, which Lena quotes in Polish. She provided the translations from the standard edition of Freud's collected works for me, so I didn't have to go and do all this complex archival work in the libraries. And I think, Lena, you know this work so well. It probably took you less time than it would have taken me, but still, this is not to belittle your efforts. You've done so much to support this translation. So it was a pleasure and an honor. I say was, I'm not quite finished. I'm towards almost finished, but you know, there's a huge amount of editing to be done as well. But so far, and I'm sure the rest will be great as well, so far this has been just such excellent co-working with you, Lena. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuesday. Appreciate your being part of our conversation and all the work you've contributed to this translation. We now turn to Louis Barth. Please.
First, I want to thank Chaim Beliak for inviting me to participate in this program. I retired from Hebrew Union College, where I was an administrator and also professor of Midrash in 2006 and kept on teaching there for a few years. But I like to say that I flunked retirement and became a psychoanalyst because it was something that I had wanted to do over the years. And my wife is a psychologist and psychoanalyst as well. What Lena's work really opened my eyes to so many aspects of the history of Poland and the place of Jews in Polish society. I think I had the impression that Poland was really filled with Ostjuden, that is, Eastern European Jews who were primarily Hasidic or Orthodox in their worldviews and in the way they functioned. And all of a sudden, I was running into something that I recognized from the last, quarter century or more in the United States, and that is women who emerged from Jewish women who were the leaders of movements that brought psychoanalysis to so many places that, it was just amazing.
Rabbi Barth, I'm going to ask you to speak up a little bit.
Okay.
People are saying they can't hear you.
They can't hear me. Okay. Well, so let me try to speak up. Okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, the thing that I was blown away with, I guess is the only way to say it, was the modern, that how all these people were so separated from their Jewish roots in certain ways, and how that separation from their Jewish roots was the result of their assumption that it was the way of becoming a human being, not just a Jew in society, and that the world opened up for them and then it really closed for them. And it closed pre-Hitler. It closed because Vienna became the center, as you point out, of the whole anti-Semitic movement in the world. I began to understand why the view of Ostjuden, which, I understood from growing up in Los Angeles, being part of a Reform community here, was so distasteful to me. And so you opened a world for me in terms of the psychoanalytic developments in Poland, but also in terms of rethinking the way Jews live there. And that was very significant for me, and I thank you for it. The other thing that was interesting to me was your own description in your document, and you mentioned sort of in passing here, that there was no Polish identity up until sort of when, the beginning of the 30s, something like that. In other words, people viewed themselves as being Austro-Hungarians, or they viewed themselves as being so different from their surrounding. And that also helped me to understand why, you use the term pariah status. It's very meaningful to me to understand that in the process of my own growing up in Los Angeles. I was born in 1938. I'm getting older, God willing. But I was conscious of the destruction of Jews in Europe during the Second World War. By the time the war was over, I grew up in a congregation here where the rabbi was originally from Romania, but he found his German identity in Berlin and then came to the United States at the last minute to Oklahoma, and was ultimately brought to Hollywood to become the senior rabbi of Temple Israel of Hollywood. And so he was not so much a hero to me, but he shaped my view of what the world was for such people. And now that, well, I think I'll stop now, but just let me say that in terms of the importance of people who trace their origins back to Galicia and then to other parts in what became Poland, their contribution to psychoanalysis is really overwhelming. And I can't wait to see the rest of the book to deepen myself in it. So thank you.
Thank you. Lena, I'm wondering if you'd like to respond to the comments that have been made, and I invite people, if they have comments, to share with us their questions, either in Polish or in English, in the chat. If you'd like to write your comments, we'll transmit them. Lena, if you'd like to respond to some of the things that...
Thank you so much for all those comments. It was very nice to hear. I'm sort of tired now with all this material. It's been many years since I started this work, and I must say that rereading my book now, after all the research I was able to do in the United States, makes me think about a necessity of an appendix or erratum, because I didn't mention this in my today's presentation, but I'm struck by the lack of the attention that I put into the troubles my protagonist faced in the United States once they emigrated. And I think I tended in my book to present their life trajectories as some kind of success story. So they didn't perish in the Holocaust. They were able to emigrate to the United States, and then they had a very long and successful careers helping to implement the psychoanalysis on the new grounds in America. And what I found in the United States is that they had a lot of troubles doing that because of the anti-Semitism that was present in the States after the Second World War, because of the McCarthyism. They were all leftists, they were all socialists, and sometimes very radical ones involved in radical groups in Central Europe. Their status as immigrants was precarious. The example I gave of Ludwig Jekels obtaining his medical license only when he was 80 years old is very speaking, isn't it? And of course, when I went to the archives in the United States, I found a lot of material covering their efforts in bringing their families and friends with them to America, and they didn't manage to do this. So they were not victims of Holocaust themselves, but they left all their lives, all lives they had, all their loved ones in Europe, and they were in a situation where they have to navigate a completely new territory in the moment of the history of the United States when it came close to an authoritarianism. Well, it was one of the blackest moments in the history of the United States, and they were victims of it. I found FBI files about key figures in psychoanalytical movement and so on. I will not develop this now, but as I said, this is a twofold story. There is a story about the lives they had in Central Europe and their efforts in constructing their identities, also their Jewish identities or even their Polish identities, because some of them, like for instance, Gustaw Bychowski, he identified as Pole. He didn't identify as a Jew even, although his father was a Zionist and a very prominent figure in Warsaw Jewish world. And then there is this break in their lives that came for many of them very late in their lives, and how what appears on a Wikipedia page as a success story was in reality much more painful, difficult, and not that simple at all. And one of the things that came out from this research in the States that I done is that their Central European origins were repressed as well as their Jewishness. So there was this taboo surrounding psychoanalysis after the war in the United States. Psychoanalytical movement tried not to present itself as a Jewish science. But for instance, I don't know if any of you know about this, but actually Sigmund Freud committed suicide on Yom Kippur. And with the extensive material there is there about Freud's life and psychoanalysis and so on, no one mentions this, never. Oh, I think it's pretty important to know about this fact. And I found material saying, for instance, that when some member of New York Psychoanalytical Society wanted to join a synagogue for Yom Kippur, it was a scandal. They had to organize a meeting and to decide how they will deal with this scandal, how would they react. Jewishness was really banned from psychoanalytical movement in the United States. And then likewise, their Central European origins, it wasn't really something they easily talk about. In necrologies, I found about some of my protagonists, their friends and disciples who tried to write their biographies down weren't able to trace anything from before they came to the United States because they never talked about this. So I'm in a moment where, like, I'm very happy that this book will appear in English. This is a great honor, and I'm look forward to international audience to read this book. But on the other hand, I would write it differently now. I would put all those American material in to complicate it even further, especially like as Dr. Barth said, the question of their identities. Who were they and how did they navigate their identities, not only in very anti-Semitic Vienna of the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20, not only with the rise of Nazism in the 30s, but also in what became their new homeland, United States of 30s and 50s.
Lena, that's a very important reflection. I do want to ask a question actually that comes from Tuesday to you, but it is in a sense an addendum to what you were talking about. She asks, why did they immigrate to the United States and not to the United Kingdom, to Britain? Would it have been easier maybe for them to, it seemed like they were faced with anti-Semitism in one place and another form of it in another place. And in addition to that, the hostility toward psychoanalysis that seemed to be constant both in Europe and in a different form in America.
Well, this was connected to a conflict between Vienna and London on the subject of child analysis. In Britain, the school of Melanie Klein was very powerful, and she opposed Freud's idea, and they split into separate groups. So when Freudians, and it was very early in the psychoanalytical movement formation, so this was a British school of psychoanalysis, which was not recognized by Freud, and one had to choose his camp. And this was the first thing. So Freudians were not welcomed in Great Britain for this reason. And the second thing is that there was not enough clients for all those psychoanalysts in Great Britain. And the market for psychoanalysis was only growing in the United States. So Ernest Jones, who was himself not Jew, and at this moment in the late 30s, he was the head of the international psychoanalytical movement. He was able to organize all those migrations. He pushed for them to apply for American visas. Some of them went to Great Britain, but it was very hard for them to make a career. Some stayed like for a year or two and then continue to the United States because they were not able to make a living in Great Britain. Some of them went to Palestine as well, not that many, but in my book, I put the thesis that what was the core of Central European psychoanalysis before war was only preserved in Israel. They really took over with this revolutionary political, intellectual dimension of Freudian theory, while in the United States, where it was a necessity for any practitioner of psychoanalysis to have a medical diploma, it became a sort of medical procedure cut off from its intellectual, cultural, political roots. But this is another story still.
Lena, you opened up dozens of questions for me. I studied with a psychoanalyst that was born in Krakow, Hillel Klein, who was a Holocaust survivor and a very central figure in the history of psychoanalysis in Israel. I look forward to asking you a dozen questions, and especially these questions that you've raised about the integration of, or the non-integration of so many people. We've come to what is officially our conclusion of the time with you, and this only means that I want to call this part one, with an invitation for you to come back. And frankly, I want you to be, in the next opportunity, a little more speculative. You're very careful with your analysis, and I appreciate your academic carefulness. We've appreciated very much the participation of you and your presentation. I want to thank panelists, Tul'si Bhambry, Louis Barth. I want to give a special thanks to Dominika Zakaszewska, who the next time we convene will be in the most Polish city in the world, Chicago, God willing, as on her Fulbright at the University of Illinois Chicago campus. And we look forward to her leading us in that activity. And we look forward to again seeing Marek Yazowski and Marzena Szymanska. I want to call to people's attention the topic for the next time, which is January 16th. We'll be sending you information. And the topic is the first really important academic study that's been written in English of what happened to the Jews that managed to be sent to prison in Siberia, fled to Siberia, etc., when the situation of the attack by the Germans in Germany in 1939 and then in 1941 found themselves in situations in Eastern Europe, and the story of what happened to them in Siberia and in Soviet provinces. The book is entitled "The Survival on the Margins: Polish Jewish Refugees in Wartime Soviet Union." It's by Eliana R. Adler, and it's an exciting history, and it's also groundbreaking, and look forward to inviting everyone back to participate with us. I want to also mention that if you are in what we call in America the end of the year mood, you're welcome to find our website, where this lecture and many others of the Freighted Legacy, as well as information about the activities of Beit Polska, Friends of Jewish Renewal in Poland, is found. And there's also a donation page where you can support our work and make it possible for us to continue this important bridging work as we learn more about the history of Jews in Poland and the very complex, and as someone who asked me, what does the word freighted mean in Freighted Legacies? Very complex, very heavy legacies of Jews from Central Europe and Poland. Many thanks to panels. Lou, did you have something you wanted to add?
I want to ask if Lena can stay on for a minute, because there's a question that I'd like to discuss with her that doesn't really relate to other people.
Okay, Lena, if you can, let's see. Any other final words from Tuesday, our panelists? Thank you once again to everyone, Lena most especially, and we look forward to seeing you on January 16th for the next installment of Freighted Legacies. Thank you.